Boldwood presents The Vintage Village Bake-Off, written by Judy Leigh and read by Phillida Nash. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Cooking is love made visible. Unknown. Prologue. 49 years ago. In the presence of God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, we have come together to witness the marriage of Harriet and Geoffrey, to pray for God's blessing on them, to share their joy, and to celebrate their love. The vicar smelled of something muddy and a strong whiff of aniseed. Hattie wondered if he'd just finished a quick burial outside. He must have rushed into the vestry to dust the soil from his hands and swig a swift glass of Pernod before starting the marriage service. She squinted at Geoffrey, sombre in his grey suit, through the dense net of her veil. She should have arranged for her father to lift it before the vows so that she could see properly, but Geoffrey had said he wanted to be the one to do it afterwards. Hattie had accepted his decision, as she had accepted that he wanted her to wear white, and that they'd have a one-tier cake with plastic figurines, because it made sense economically, even though it was her father who was paying for the reception. She was used to doing things as others wished. She'd never really liked the wedding dress. Right now she hated it. It let in the cold. It was uncomfortable and stiff. It rustled and creaked like a ghost when she moved. Bunty had said she should wear red velvet. Geoffrey had suggested she should choose a sensible frock that would look appropriate next to him. In the end, she'd settled for a traditional satin gown. She'd let her mother have the final say. The brocade around the neck itched and left a red mark. It made her think of Anne Boleyn just before her execution. She peered at Geoffrey again. He wasn't looking at her. She needed a smile, some encouragement from someone, anyone. On a girl's wedding day, wasn't she supposed to be excited, beautiful, tingling with anticipation? Hattie felt cold and alone. The church was draughty, and the sleeves on her dress were transparently thin. The truth was, so far, the marriage wasn't as she'd hoped. The wedding service was hardly a celebration of eternal love. Incessant rain battered against the stained glass windows from wash. Everyone in the church had wet feet and looked miserable. Hattie's mother wore a crumpled peach suit, a wide-brimmed hat, and a blank face. She stood grimly between Aunt Maud and Aunt Dorothy, who sported matching sour faces, pillar-box red lipstick and jackets with fur collars that looked as if rats had died simultaneously around their necks. Hattie wished that her mother were the sort that sobbed into a tissue, heartbroken at the loss of her dear daughter. But she was simply compliant about everything. Life, love, death, marriage. It was all the same continued theme of drudgery. Harriet wondered if she'd inherited her mother's submissiveness. She hoped not. The vicar was talking to the congregation about comfort in marriage and honour in love. Hattie had no idea what that meant. Geoffrey's face was expressionless. He was clearing his throat. It was a sound that she found a little irritating. It meant that he thought he was about to say something important. He trotted out his vows, his voice like the rattle of a machine gun. She glanced around for her siblings for a bit of reassurance. Robert was in the pew to the left, inspecting his shoes. Without checking, Harriet knew they'd be highly polished and conventional, just like Robert. He was a school teacher, studious and serious. Hattie had always wanted to be a nurse, one of those carefree, romantic women with bouffant hair she'd read about in cheap paperbacks. She'd smile a lot, wear a pristine uniform, and fall for a handsome young doctor who saved children's lives. Instead, she'd studied shorthand typing, and now she was a sensible secretary who spent hours each day sitting on a hard chair. Behind her, Bunty was fidgeting with the straps of her bridesmaid's dress, looking stunning in the pink silk she'd insisted on, making eyes at the best man or any man who glanced her way. Bunty was always bored, on the lookout for fun. She'd be centre stage at the reception, dancing and showing off by herself, all eyes on her performance. She'd end up snogging the DJ from Clive's Groove-to-Go disco. This was typical of Bunty. Hattie thought it was depressing that both daughters had inherited their mother's serial acquiescence. Hattie did as she was told, and Bunty craved approval. Nurture had a lot to answer for. Her heart had started to thump. The vicar was talking to her, the reek of aniseed. "Harriet, will you take Geoffrey to be your husband? Will you obey him and serve him, love him, comfort him, honour and protect him, and, forsaking all others, be faithful to him as long as you both shall live?" Hattie's lips were suddenly glued together. Her mouth wouldn't move. But her mind was bursting with so many thoughts. Geoffrey was the perfect husband for her. Her father had said so. He was sensible, authoritative, strong. He looked smart in a suit. He was wise about things that mattered: money, firm decisions, organising. He wasn't frivolous. Her mother repeated that her priority was to find a man who'd provide a home. Hattie thought for a moment that it might be nice to meet a man who provided some laughter. Suddenly her legs were jelly. "I will," she said, surprised by the sound of her own voice. The vicar addressed the congregation in a mourning tone, muttering about pouring blessings everywhere. Hattie wasn't listening. Behind the veil, she had a fuzzy view of the congregation. Her family, awkward friends in ill-fitting clothes, the dour in-laws-to-be, their arms folded, faces like grim reapers. She noticed the vicar's greasy hair combed to one side, Geoffrey's long face, his pale eyes. He mumbled more words without looking at her. One of them was love. Hattie thought about the meaning of love. Was it passion, devotion, kindness, or routine? She'd believed she loved Geoffrey, but now, standing in a cold, echoing church, wearing a thin dress she didn't like much, she wasn't so sure. For a moment, she wished she were perched at the church organ, belting out one of her favourite tunes, or walking in the park by herself in sploshing rain, hoping the sun would come out. The vicar was frowning, urging her to speak. There was silence as the congregation waited. Hattie said in one breath, "From this day forward, for better for worse, for richer for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death us do part." And that was it. A ring was clamped on her finger. The veil was lifted. Geoffrey kissed her with cold lips, and somebody behind her clapped and cheered. It was probably Bunty. Hattie waited to feel lifted on a cloud of intense happiness. But instead the draught from beneath the wooden church door seeped through the nave and chilled. There were hushed voices, the congregation praying for the couple, their words sombre. But Hattie's only thought was that she was a wife now, no longer Hattie Parkin. She was Mrs. Geoffrey Bowen, and with it would come so many changes. They'd move into the bungalow, sleep in the same bed. She would make his packed lunch every day, 4 slices of white bread, ham and lettuce, a thin sliver of tomato. The service was almost over. The reception would begin soon, and there would be music, speeches, cutting the cake. Champagne would fizz in glasses, music would play, and dancing would start. The Osmonds, Love Me for a Reason, The Who, Won't Get Fooled Again. Perhaps then the party would explode into life and the sensation of euphoria would take over. Hattie hunched her shoulders and took Geoffrey's stiff arm as he led her down the aisle and out into the dripping rain, considering how marriage would change her life. Chapter 1. The Present. Hattie crept across the living room with her shoulders hunched. She'd moved that way since the first day of her marriage to Geoffrey almost 50 years ago, and she still edged her way around the bungalow almost a year after he'd left her for a woman from the bowling club. If she closed her eyes and thought about it for a moment, Hattie could imagine him sitting in the armchair, grumbling, "What's wrong with you, woman? You're always hovering. You're neither use nor ornament. Why don't you go and do something useful like the washing up?" They were divorced now. Just. It had been quick, uncontested on both sides. All his belongings had been removed from the bungalow, photographs, clothes. But, despite his absence, his influence seemed to stay. Standing in front of the piano, hesitating again, she thought about playing her favourite piece. She hadn't played properly for a long time. Her hands still shook with fear, even after all these years. She had been good once, very good. But Geoffrey would have listened to the first dramatic chord, covered his ears during the tentative notes that followed, and said in a blustery voice, "Oh, no, not that damned awful racket again. For God's sake, woman, I'm trying to read my paper." She stretched her fingers. She'd play it now, perfectly. Hattie tried the first chord, Chopin Fantasy Impromptu, Opus 66. The notes that followed were strong. She was a talented pianist. Then her fingers tightened. She'd made a mistake, a discordant clang on the notes. She could almost hear Geoffrey's scornful laugh. "You're out of practice, Hattie. The old fingers aren't as nimble as they were. You're past your sell-by date, love." Then he'd snicker in that mean way he had, and she'd feel sad. Go back to her armchair and pick up a magazine on home care. She recalled Geoffrey telling her she wasn't much of a homemaker either. She touched the old photograph in its shiny plastic frame, the only one on the top of the piano. Light streamed through the window onto the glass, revealing a film of dust. No, she was no homemaker. Geoffrey had been right. Everything in the bungalow was past its best. Hattie sighed. The picture and the piano were relics of the 1950s. They had seen better days. The magnolia walls were dingy, the colour of grime. The piano was her mother's, battle-scarred, the wooden frame scuffed, rings from many forgotten teacups making stubborn circles on the veneer. And the discoloured piano keys, like bared ancient teeth, made a jangly, slightly out-of-tune sound when played, even though it was regularly tuned. Hattie wondered whether it was time to get rid of it. But Geoffrey would have liked that, so she'd keep it for now. The black and white photo had faded. The three children in the foreground posed for the camera, and Hattie caressed each face in turn with a fingertip. Robert John Parkin, the oldest, blonde curls flopping over his eyes, a pale, serious face. Her brother was a dreamer. He'd always been lost in his own thoughts. In the middle was Bunty, slim, oblivious of everyone else, tousled dark hair, a smile filling her small face, all teeth, christened Elizabeth after the Queen. She was the youngest, the spoilt one. And on the left side, a little apart from the others, stood solemn Harriet Ann Parkin. Hattie, the middle child, the invisible one, the one who mattered least. She had allowed her insignificance to continue throughout her marriage to Geoffrey Bowen, and afterwards throughout her life. "Shit," Hattie muttered to herself, a moment of realization that she had wasted too many moments thinking of Geoffrey. That happened a lot. She wondered if she should. Geoffrey was gone. He couldn't criticize her any more. So why, as she stood at the piano, did she feel her shoulders tense? It was as if he was sitting behind her, his face filled with a familiar, contemptuous sneer. She heard his miserable voice saying, "You've never been any good, Hattie. You don't have the skills. Mediocrity is your middle name." And Hattie would think in her head, "No, it's Anne. My middle name is Anne." But she'd never dared to say it aloud. When Geoffrey had taken up with Linda from the bowling club almost a year ago, it was a blessed relief. It was as if gates had opened wide, allowing her to walk free, breathe new, fresh air. But she hadn't reconnected with Robert and Bunty as much as she'd have liked. Geoffrey's meanness had kept them away for years, and her siblings were set in their ways. Hattie had always believed she was closer to Robert than to Bunty, despite her sister's effusive texts about how they were sisters forever. But when Robert had moved to Devon 5 years ago, Hattie had cried for days. She hadn't understood why he wanted to live so far away, why he'd leave her alone with Geoffrey. She'd visited him twice in his new home, both times with grumbling Geoffrey in tow. Robert's little village was not far from Dawlish, where the train tracks rolled by close to the sea, and Hattie had thought it beautiful. She ought to visit him again. Hattie's fingers slid lightly over the dull ivory keys, trying a tentative note. Her fingers shook as they hovered. She rested both hands on the keys, then she tried a phrase or two. Again, Chopin, Fantasy Impromptu, Opus 66. She played the chord perfectly, her fingers floating easily across the notes, and, for a while, beautiful sounds filled the air. She made a crashing mistake, a raucous sound that echoed like a fairground tune, and stopped dead. The silence rang. She hadn't practiced enough. She could have been good. As a 15-year-old, she dreamed of being a concert pianist. But it was too late now. Shit, Hattie muttered again, wondering why she was speaking so quietly. Immediately she saw Geoffrey's pinched face looming in front of her. She heard his irritated voice. "Swearing is uncouth, Harriet. There's no place." He was a hypocrite. He swore all the time, but she never mentioned it. She tried again, out loud, but her voice was still shaky. "You can go to hell, Geoffrey." She imagined his bloated cheeks reddening. She could hear the sneer in his tone. "Whatever's wrong with you, woman? What's the matter?" "Shit," Hattie said again. Then she said it louder. "Shit, shit, shit, shit." Hattie placed both hands firmly on the keys and banged them down with a discordant, resounding clang. "Shit." She said it with more feeling. It didn't matter how many times she said it. Her life was still empty. She'd been released from 50 years of prison after the marriage from hell, but now her world was filled with missed opportunities, and the present was a dull routine that repeated itself on a daily basis. Hattie decided it was time for a cup of tea. It was what she did when there was a gap in her day. She'd wake up, have breakfast, wash, clean her teeth, brush her hair, check the post, then she'd have a cup of tea. She stared at her hands. Plain hands. No wedding ring now. She was alone in a small modern bungalow on a small housing estate in Bodycut, Oxfordshire. and the silence screamed at her from each corner like a ghoul. She made for the warmth of the little kitchen and the temporary security of tea for one. When the brew was suitably strong, she hauled out the tea bag, adding a modest glug of milk. There was a rapping of knuckles against the window. She glanced up and felt fretful and optimistic at the same time. It was Glenys from next door, not Geoffrey. He seldom visited now, but he probably had a key. The thought of him entering her home with it made her nerves jangle in the same way they had for years. Hattie smiled a welcoming grin. Glenys Edwards was a good sort. She was in her early 60s, full of energy, always dressed in her best, married to Bill, who sorted letters at the post office in Banbury. Glenys liked to check on Hattie regularly, to make sure you're still alive and kicking. Hattie instinctively liked her, and that was a dilemma too. She'd invite her in, and Glenys would sit at the table over a cooling cuppa and talk for over an hour. Hattie was pleased to have company, but she was relieved when Glenys left. That was the problem. You were no good alone, and you weren't any good in company either. "Hello, Glenys," Hattie said. "What can I do for you?" "It's more about what I can do for you, my lovely," Glenys enthused. She was already inside the kitchen, bustling towards the table, waving a piece of paper she'd cut from a newspaper. "I bring tidings of great joy." She glanced at Hattie's full cup. "Cuppa going spare, is it?" Hattie moved to the kettle, wondering if her sigh had been audible. But Glenys seemed not to have noticed as she flourished the clipping. "It's half-price day at Cloud 9 tomorrow. I thought it'd be an opportunity. You could get yourself a good pampering." Hattie frowned. "Pampering? I don't usually pamper myself." "Well, it's about time you did. There's a beauty therapist there. Nikki, she's called. She's in her early 20s, but she's properly on trend with all the treatments. She does wonders for the older woman. I mean, look at me." Hattie looked. Glenys seemed no different from how she usually looked. Hattie squinted. "Ah, I see." Glenys put her hands on her hips, did a little wiggle and batted her eyelashes. "I get everything done there." "Everything?" "Oh yes, brow lamination, lash lift and tint, hydrofacial, and her chemical peel is to die for." Hattie had no idea what Glenys was talking about. "It's probably not for me." "Oh, but it is," Glenys insisted. "I booked an appointment for myself tomorrow, and Nikki said if I bring a friend, I can get extra discount for us both. So, I've booked you in." "What for?" Hattie shook her head anxiously. "Well, maybe it's time you got your mojo back, you know," Glenys said confidentially. "Come out of the 70s with your look and bring on something a bit more modern and racier." Hattie didn't know. "Such as? A facial, maybe, you know. Jazz yourself up a bit. Get a younger style. Maybe lash extensions or—" "Oh, you mean beauty treatments?" Hattie finally cottoned on. "Oh, no, it's not really me. I don't go anywhere much." "Then maybe you should," Glenys said. "Give yourself a special treat for once, instead of being cooped up here staring at the same four walls." Hattie paused. Maybe Glenys had a point. Perhaps she should take more care of herself. What was the word she'd used? Hattie imagined herself lying on a sunbed, warm oil poured over her shoulders, enjoying a light massage. She'd breathe out all her anxieties as tension was pressed from aching muscles. She tried a smile. "Well, maybe I could have a manicure, perhaps." "Right, that's sorted." Glenys accepted the steaming cup of tea Hattie offered. "That's good, then. We'll have a talk about what options you want to pick when we arrive tomorrow at 1 o'clock. but there's laser hair removal, injectable hyaluronic acid lip fillers, micropigmentation. Hattie looked at her chipped nails and imagined her hands neatly manicured, playing the piano beautifully. It might encourage her to start practicing again. She smiled. Well, maybe a pearly varnish. Bring it on. Glenys slurped happily. I can't wait for you to meet Nicky. She'll discover the real vamp in you and get rid of the fuddy-duddy side. You won't know yourself when she's finished with you, Hattie. You wait and see. Chapter 2. The next morning, Hattie sat at the breakfast table, staring into her bowl of dry muesli. She was definitely feeling down in the dumps. It was to do with what Glenys had said yesterday while they shared a cup of tea. Hattie knew she ought to do something about her stuttering life, but she wasn't sure a beauty treatment was the answer to bigger problems. She lifted a magazine Glenys had left behind, filled with glossy photos of famous actresses whom Glenys had declared are all your age, 70s, and look at them, they are gorgeous. Hattie flicked the pages. Smiling women gazed back, poised and glamorous, almost faultless apart from attractive laughter lines. Meryl Streep, Helen Mirren, Joanna Lumley, Cher, Grace Jones. Hattie flicked the pages. Jane Fonda, Joan Collins, much older and positively glowing. She stared down again at the chipped nails, the dry, wrinkled hands that hesitated over the piano keys. A manicure would be good. It's just the tip of the iceberg, Hattie said as Joan Collins smiled back from the magazine. Something wriggled in Hattie's mind. The two words Glenys had used, repeating themselves like scurrying ants. Fuddy-duddy, fuddy-duddy. She could hear Geoffrey saying it, his laugh full of mockery. You've turned into a fuddy-duddy, Hat, a stuffy old... She needed someone to talk to about how dejected she was. But there was no one she could turn to, not really. There were people she met at yoga once a week. She knew them all by their first names, but she had no one to confide in. She needed someone, and only one person came to mind. She picked up her mobile and turned it over. The age spots and a blue vein stood out on her hand. Hattie pressed a button and listened to the ring. It beeped continuously. She counted 10 times. And, just as she thought it would ring out, a dry, tentative voice said, "Hello?" Hattie's heart leapt. "Robert, is that you?" There was a pause, as if he was not sure. Then he said, "Hello, Hattie. I've been in the garden. I was collecting the first of the marrows. They make nice jam, with ginger and lemon." "Ah!" Hattie wondered what to say next. "Right." "Is everything okay, Hat? I mean, are you well? Or is it Bunty?" Something in Robert's voice sounded as if he was expecting the worst. "Oh, Bunty's fine, as far as I know." Hattie gave a little laugh and wondered why she'd done it. "I mean, yes, I just wanted a chat." "A chat?" Robert repeated. "About what?" "Oh, this and that," Hattie said. "You know, we could catch up, talk." "What do you want to talk about?" Robert's voice was quiet. Hattie could hardly hear him. "The weather's nice. Well, I mean, it's been nice. June was nice. July's a bit miserable. It rained yesterday." Robert paused for a moment, then he said, "Is everything all right? You seem a bit what? A bit odd." "Don't you ever feel—" Hattie's eyes filled with tears. She swallowed hard. She didn't want to sound upset. Robert only had her voice to go on. "Do you ever feel a bit lonely?" No, I have the garden, the goats, the chickens. I keep myself busy.
Oh,
Hattie gulped.
that's nice.
What's bothering you? Robert asked quietly. Do you need to come down and stay for a bit? She took a breath. She had to ask the question.
Do you think I'm a fuddy-duddy, Robert?
That was it.
The 2 words were out.
A what?
Hattie had to say them again. My neighbour said I needed to get rid of the fuddy-duddy side of me.
Robert laughed affectionately. You've always been a fuddy-duddy, Hat, ever since you were a child.
In what way?
Hattie heard the indignation in her words. Well, Robert was quiet on the other end of the phone, thinking. You were old beyond your years when you were 6, and 10, and 12, and 15, you know, a bit conventional, in your dress and manners.
Hattie said nothing, allowing him to dig a hole for himself. Then she whispered, I had no idea.
Oh, it's not a bad thing, being a bit of a fuddy-duddy, Robert muttered. I suppose I'm the same, stuck in my ways. I mean, we're not like Bunty now, are we? All razzmatazz and all that jazz.
Hattie had no idea what Robert meant exactly, but for a moment she felt that having some razzmatazz and all that jazz was the most exciting thing in the world, and the opposite of that was to be a fuddy-duddy. A deep sigh escaped from somewhere near her heart. Well, thanks, Robert. You've cleared that up.
Have I? Robert asked. Oh, well, that's good. I have to feed the chickens. I'm using their eggs to make a Victoria sponge.
Oh, you're eating cake?
Hattie was only half listening. Well, not just me. The people at the gardening club are very partial to my cakes. Susan Joyce said so. I thought I'd perfect my recipe.
Right, Hattie gritted her teeth. Is she a fuddy-duddy too?
Who?
Susan Joyce?
No, she's quite nice. Robert paused, realising what he'd said. I mean, she's quite ordinary. Not really a fuddy-duddy.
Thanks, Robert. And what does that make me? Harriet's teeth were clenched.
Not that you're not ordinary too, Hat. I mean, you are ordinary. Ordinary is not bad. It's better than fuddy-duddy. I mean, not better. It's just different.
Were you so diplomatic with all those parents when you were a head teacher, Robert? Hattie said.
Oh, I didn't need to be. I mean, it was a long time ago.
Certainly was. Long before you became a fuddy-duddy too.
Pardon?
Robert was confused. Oh, never mind. I'm sorry, Robert. I'm just having a moment. His voice came back to her.
Are you all right? I've never heard you sound this way. A bit, I don't know, not quite yourself. Why don't you pop down to me for a visit? Stay for a day or two. You could meet the gardening club and have a slice of cake.
Oh, no, I can't do that. I'm far too busy. Hattie heard the new determination in her own voice. I'm off for a facial this afternoon. Some pampering, maybe a bit of laser hair removal, injectable hyaluronic acid lip fillers, micropigmentation.
Oh, Robert had no idea what she was talking about.
The new me, the one with razzmatazz and all that jazz. A bit of liposuction here and there, then I'll really be down with the kids. There'll be no more being a fuddy-duddy for yours truly. Oh, no. I'll be just like Joan Collins.
Hat, are you all right?
Never better. Hattie pushed the bowl of muesli away and stood up. Sorry, Robert, I have to go. I'll leave you to your marrow jam and your Victoria sponge and the village gardening club. I'm off for an important appointment with my Botox surgeon. Hattie ended the call and took a deep breath. All was quiet now, but her thoughts raced like a charging cavalry. Her eyes filled with tears again. She knew the truth of it. She'd been a fuddy-duddy child and grown into a fuddy-duddy adult, and life had led her to this place where she was so set in her ways that she didn't recognize herself any more. Marriage to obnoxious Geoffrey had been penal servitude, a life sentence, and she'd emerged from the other side of the harrowing experience as the same dull, shrinking violet that she'd always been. That had been a mistake. Hattie frowned. Things had to change. It was about time. She'd visit the beautician, Nicky, and she'd ask for something dramatic, something life-changing. At least she'd ask for a manicure with scarlet fingernails. She had to start somewhere. The woman with the scarlet fingernails sat in the railway carriage, staring through the window as the train pulled out of Liverpool Lime Street. The journey would take 3.5 hours, 2 changes. She gazed around to see if there was anyone interesting in the carriage to talk to. The man opposite, a balding business type with the sweet, plump face of a cherub, was busy on his laptop. She imagined him to be in his 30s, a chirpy wife, a child, maybe 2 young boys. The woman across the aisle, chattering into her phone, was talking to someone who wanted to end the call. The woman's face was determined, her voice desperate to be listened to. She was interrupting, gabbling. They were always signs of loneliness. She glanced and decided she was good at working people out just from looking at them. She placed a hand over her smile. So why had she made so many mistakes over the years? Uncomfortable in the hard seat, she crossed her legs, thinking that she probably looked like a young Elizabeth Taylor. In her 70s, just, she could pass for 10, 15 years younger, she was sure. She glanced at the hefty suitcase at her feet, stuffed with her best clothes, hurriedly packed. She wouldn't go back now. She'd be in Banbury by late afternoon. Then she'd start a new life. She wondered if she should text Hattie and tell her that she was on her way. Or perhaps she'd turn up, stand on the doorstep of the little bungalow on the small housing estate, yell, "Surprise, surprise!" and they'd fall into each other's arms, drink tea, eat cake, and she'd tell her sister all about it. Hattie would understand. She was set in her ways, she always had been, but she had a kind heart. Besides, her bossy husband had taken away any exuberance Hattie had possessed long ago. It had been too long since they'd seen each other. They'd grown apart. That was the problem. One of many. She felt her phone vibrate in her bag and reached in crimson-tipped fingers and pulled it out. It was Sean calling again. How many times had he called since she stepped on the boat? 15? She cut the call once more. She had no intention of replying. She wouldn't look back. She reached for a magazine from her bag and stared at the pictures for a while, flicking the pages disinterestedly. Gossip about royals, something about Brad Pitt's daily workout plan, his fitness regime. She thought fleetingly that Brad Pitt was her type, rich, handsome, a little wild. Sean had been like that once. The horoscope page was near the end of the magazine, and she glanced down the list of star signs until she came to her own. Aries, the ram. Her birthday was late March. Apparently her characteristics were courageous, honest, energetic, generous. The article went on to say that the negative side of these traits was that a typical Aries could be reckless, tactless, overbearing, and impulsive. That was her to a T. She scanned the page for news about how her day would unfold. Autonomous, willful, and determined, rams are very good at flying solo, and that's your best strategy. It's a good day to hit the road, or treadmill, or track, and discover what you really want. Then go after it with determination and guile, as only you can. Time alone will make you energized and strong. Put your head down and barrel through on your lonesome without anyone to slow you down. This is your time." A sigh came from beneath her smart jacket. How right the stars were. She was going it alone now. Sean O'Connor wouldn't be in her life any more. She was looking forward, on her way to Banbury on a train to see her sister. She hesitated. She wasn't sure at all. Sean had been her rock, her soulmate. They'd been through so much together. And there was the one thing they never talked about, which drove a wedge between them. For a moment she felt the ache of separation, sadness. Tears came and she wiped them. She'd done it now. There was no looking back. Her phone pinged again and she opened a message, smiling. Of course, she wasn't completely on her own. That was part of the plan. That was why she'd left Sean. The message read, "Stay in touch and let me know when you arrive, gorgeous." Her grin widened as she thumbed the reply. "Can't wait. See you soon, handsome." Then she closed the magazine and leaned back in her seat, closing her eyes, letting a daydream pull her into the centre. It was very close now. Soon she'd be living a new life. She hoped she'd done the right thing. Chapter 3. Hattie turned up at Cloud 9 in the High Street at 3 minutes to 1, feeling nervous. She wished she and Glenys could have gone together, but her neighbour had left earlier to call on a friend. It had taken her ages to find a space in a car park, and she was already tense. She was even more anxious when she saw Glenys, dressed in leather trousers and a red puffer jacket, looking very much the trendy woman about town. By her side, with her growing-out grey bob and her light beige mackintosh, Hattie suspected she looked like a bag lady. The wind buffeted down the high street. Despite being July, it was cold as any October day, the skies ditch-water dull. Glenys's smile was bright. "You came," she beamed, as if she hadn't expected Hattie to arrive. Hattie wasn't sure she wanted to be there at all. "Oh, you're booked in for 2 hours. We both want the works," Glenys said. Hattie thought she looked momentarily insane. "Pampering is what we need." Glenys laughed with wild abandon. "My Bill doesn't know I come here. He believes it's all as nature intended. But we girls have to have some secrets." Hattie had no secrets at all, and she hadn't been a girl for well over 60 years. She stared at the window pane. The gold neon sign proclaiming Cloud 9, an illuminated rain cloud with a flashing purple 9 in the centre. The window was full of pictures of beautiful young women and words that Hattie didn't understand. Microdermabrasion and browtox. She wondered if a chemical peel was something to do with oranges. She imagined a delightful citrus smell as a tangerine-scented cream was applied to her face. She groaned inwardly. She was here now. She'd make the best of it. Inside, a young woman in a white coat with a blonde ponytail was seated at a desk, staring at a computer screen. She looked up. "Glenys, bang on time, and this must be your friend, Harriet Bowen." The sound of Geoffrey's surname still had the ability to turn Hattie's shoulders to concrete. She said, "Just a manicure, please." "I'm Nicky," the blonde woman said. "Glenys is having some microdermabrasion today. Lovely." "And a body peel," Glenys grinned. Hattie couldn't help pulling a face as she imagined poor Glenys's skin red and excoriated, just like a Rembrandt painting she'd once seen. It might have been called The Anatomy Lesson, and it depicted a man on a slab being cut open. In Hattie's imagination, Glenys was lying on a slab, smiling and chattering, while Nicky sliced her flesh with a scalpel and talked about her new boyfriend and what she was doing at the weekend. Hattie shuddered. And then she realised that Nicky was speaking to her. "We'll be out for you in a moment, Mrs. Bowen." "Hattie," Hattie interrupted, shaking her head. She had missed the first bit of Nicky's words and hoped she'd repeat them. Nicky waved towards one of the treatment rooms, where the white doors with gold knobs were ominously closed. "Follow me then, Glenys. She won't be long, Hattie." Hattie was about to ask, "Who won't be long?" But Nicky was on her way into one of the white rooms, Glenys scuttling behind her, muttering, "Enjoy," with a wink, before she disappeared. Hattie wondered if the word enjoy was a secret for enjoy it. All the treatments were painful. Her heart was thumping more than it should. She glanced at her hands, imagining red talons. It wasn't her. Not really. Then a woman was standing in front of her. "Mrs. Bowen?" "Hattie, please." Hattie looked at a woman who might have been in her 40s, her intensely black hair pulled back severely. She was very slim, wearing a white coat. Her expression was without humour, making Hattie think of a prison warden. She wondered if she had time to sprint for the door and make a getaway. Instead, she bleated, "A manicure, just a pale pink." "I have you booked in for the whole self-care package, 2 hours," the woman replied without a smile. "I'm Yvonne. Would you like to follow me?" Hattie stood up nervously, feeling like Joan of Arc on the way to the stake. She took a breath, wondering what to say, how to minimise the ordeal. Yvonne led the way into a white-walled room, and Hattie stared around. There was a table, a sink, lots of bottles, and in the corner a tall electric machine with a headpiece that wouldn't have looked out of place on death row. Yvonne said, "I'll give you 5 minutes." Hattie frowned. To calm down? To get undressed? Undressed? Hattie hadn't realised she'd need to take her clothes off. It was like going to the doctor's. Yvonne managed a half-smile. "Down to your panties, then slip into the robe." She indicated a white fluffy dressing gown, hanging on a gold hook behind the door. "Then pop onto the bed." Hattie glanced nervously at the table. It was just like the doctor's. She recalled smear tests and the angiogram she'd had at the well-woman clinic she'd attended a year ago. She winced. Yvonne had gone. Then music began to leak through the speakers, slow and sonorous, as if someone had died. Hattie thought of the music played in the crematorium when her father passed away. Hattie struggled out of her clothes and into the robe, wondering who had worn it before and what had happened to them. It seemed freshly laundered. Perhaps that was to remove the blood of the last victim. Hattie reprimanded herself. She was being silly. This was pampering, not torture. Then it came to her head that the loud music that sounded like whales swimming underwater was there to muffle Glenys's screams next door, or her own. There was a light knock on the door. "Are you ready?" Hattie gritted her teeth and sat on the edge of the bed. Yvonne came in and approached her. "So, what were you thinking of today?" A facial?" Hattie blurted hopefully. It seemed the least likely to hurt. "If I might suggest," Yvonne leaned over and started to touch Hattie's face in a way she thought a little forward. "We could do a nice aromatherapy face, neck and shoulder massage for rejuvenation. But first we could tidy up the straggly brows and get rid of this excess facial hair." "Facial hair?" Hattie was horrified. She hadn't noticed. "Just a few broom handles, a quick wax, and you'll be smooth for weeks. Then a nice brow tint. You won't believe the difference when you walk out of the salon. You'll be a new woman." Will I? Although, if I could suggest one thing, Yvonne gave a low cough. You have great cheekbones, and your skin has a natural sheen to it. You remind me of Helen Mirren, so... So? Hattie felt ready for anything now. She was about to be waxed and plucked, although she had no idea what that entailed. Yvonne seemed to know what she was doing, though. The hair is all wrong. It's doing you no favours, and when you come out of here, the rest of you will look bang on. Bang on? Hattie closed her eyes. Yvonne had wiped her face with something that smelled like industrial cleaner. Now she was smearing something above her upper lip, onto her chin. When you leave here, pop into Die Hard up the road from here and ask for Michelle. She's a junior stylist and they do walk-ins today. She'll fit you in, do a nice pixie cut, get rid of the dull grey and give you a proper sheen. Okay? Ouch! Hattie yelped. Yvonne had ripped something from her top lip, like a plaster. It stung. And she heard Yvonne's breathy laugh. Nearly done. The pain is worth the wonderful smooth skin you'll have. Ow! Hattie shrieked. More liquid was applied to her face. It smelt floral. The music filled her ears, whale sounds beneath the sea surface. Hattie sighed. Time to relax, Yvonne said, her voice light as a sigh. Enjoy. I'll try, Hattie muttered. Mr. Bowen won't know you when you get home. He'll be so impressed, though. There is no Mr. Bowen, Hattie said quickly. I'm divorced now. Oh, I'm sorry, Yvonne began. Not at all, Hattie said. My marriage was nearly 50 years of non-stop misery. Then he went off with a woman from the bowling club. She's welcome to him. Good riddance. She was surprised at the strength of her own words. So, it's just you, Yvonne said. Just me, Hattie repeated. Me too, Yvonne sighed. 2 kids, both teenagers. My ex is no help. I'm with you on that one. Good riddance. Exactly, Hattie said, feeling the warmth of female bonding as Yvonne's smooth hands slid around her face and neck. This feels nice. Oh, your skin will benefit, Yvonne agreed. It's so good to pamper yourself. And I can see you're a strong woman. Time to put yourself first. Indeed. Hattie could feel her eyelids becoming heavy. Her nose was filled with the calming scent of lavender, and all around her the sound of happy wails cooed calmly from the speakers. I'm strong. I put myself first, she sighed. It was her new mantra, and it was good. Hattie felt herself drift into a dream, where she was at the centre, glamorous in a pink-fitted dress and long gloves. She was Marilyn Monroe singing Diamonds Are a Girl's Best Friend, surrounded by a handsome beau in suits who gazed at her adoringly. Then she was asleep, snorting through her pursed lips while Yvonne massaged her shoulders with pungent oil. It was past 5 when she parked the silver Nissan Micra in the drive. She wondered if she should change it for something sporty. A Mazda MX-5, perhaps. She'd heard they were racy, and she was determined that the words fuddy-duddy would never be used about her again. She stepped from the Micra, her face gleaming, proud of her newly cut silver pixie style, clutching several bags of shopping from a trendy clothes shop. Geoffrey had always told her she should have sensible clothes, skirts, blouses, flat shoes. Ordinary clothes for an ordinary woman. You don't want to stand out from the crowd, Hattie. But that was in the past. She'd bought a jumpsuit, jeans, a flowing dress, and Geoffrey would never have believed it possible. Kinky boots. She had no idea what kinky boots were, in truth. But these were long and black and had a zip and a heel, and she imagined herself wearing them over jeans, looking kinky or slinky or sexy, something she hadn't felt for 50 years. Hattie felt powerful and strong for she was determined not to be boring and staid, or the 2 words she'd never speak aloud again. No, Hattie had reinvented herself. She'd made another appointment the following week at Cloud 9 for a hot stones massage. She decided that Devon was nice. In fact, she was rather good fun. Next time, she'd tell her about what a domineering pig Geoffrey was throughout their marriage, how nasty he could be, and how she'd put up with him without argument for a quiet life. Hattie would listen to a story about Yvonne's horrible ex Ryan, and then she'd say, "How awful! And you can't imagine how hard it was to live with Geoffrey. For example, one Christmas, he said the turkey was undercooked, and I was trying to give him campylobacteriosis, whatever that meant. And he called me Batty Hattie and hurled the whole plate of food against the wall. I spent Christmas afternoon washing lumps of gravy from the anaglypta." Hattie found that she was smiling. It hadn't been funny at the time. She'd cried all the way through the Queen's speech, and well into the repeat of the Morecambe and Wise show. But she saw the funny side of it now, in slow motion, like a cartoon. He was abusive, idiotic, and thankfully gone forever. She was the new Hattie, the glamorous one who had radiant skin and a cute hairdo and a new wardrobe and kinky boots. She approached the front door and the smile froze. Someone was sitting on a suitcase wearing sunglasses, staring at her. Hattie stared back. "It can't be." "I could say the same about you." Bunty leapt up and flung her arms wide. "I've been waiting for ages. The taxi dropped me off hours ago. But I can see you've been out having fun. You look great. I hardly recognised you." Hattie was surprised to feel herself enveloped in muscular arms, almost lifted from her feet. Bunty was several inches taller and much curvier. Hattie couldn't breathe for a moment. Then she recovered her wits and said, "I wasn't expecting you. You didn't ring or text to say you were coming." She examined Bunty's face, looking hard for a reason. "Where's Sean?" "Ah," Bunty gulped, then smiled. "Sean's in Ireland in Ballycotton." "Does he know you're here?" Hattie was immediately suspicious. "Not really." "Does he or not?" "I've left him." Hattie put down her bags and left him as in for a short holiday. "Left him as in forever." Hattie shook her head to process the new information. "Why?" "I don't know. It was time." Hattie understood. She should have called time after the first year of her marriage. Earlier. She nodded. "Fair enough. You'd better come in." "I thought you'd never ask." Bunty stood up, rubbing her aching hips. "I thought it would be warm in Oxfordshire, but it's even colder than Ireland." Hattie jangled the keys in her hand. "So, do you want to stay with me for a bit, until you've worked things out?" Bunty bustled in. "There's nothing to work out. I'm not going back. It's over." "And you want to stay with me?" Hattie left her sentence unfinished, waiting for her sister to say something time-related, such as, "For a week or two, or until I get myself my own place." Bunty said, "Yes, please," and tugged off her sunglasses, gazing around the kitchen, her face shining with new delight. "This place is so cosy. I'm dying for a cuppa. Shall we have coffee? I need a coffee after sitting on that smelly train for so long. Strong, please, black, 1 sugar. And I'm starving, Hat. I've only had a sandwich since breakfast, and that was cheese and onion." "What's for dinner? I don't suppose you have any chicken. I'd love a curry." "That's my favourite. Do you know how to cook a tikka? And do you have any wine?" "Or Prosecco, both." She gripped Hattie's shoulder. "Oh, we'll have such fun, Hat. Me and you, sisters together, reunited, living the life. It's just so nice to be home." Chapter 4. A very English gentleman in a pale shirt, jacket and trousers and a Panama hat knelt in the garden, squatting between the rows of neatly spaced vegetables. He pushed the round metal glasses back on his sun-pink nose, muttering to himself. A small cat, black with a white ruffle and white socks, crouched down beside him and looked up inquisitively. The man met the cat's green eyes. "Chard, runner bean, broad bean, early potato, rhubarb, radish, rocket. All coming along very nicely." He reached out and plucked a groundsel shoot. "We don't want you here." His voice was light, without malice. "All good. Let's have a look at the fruit bushes now, shall we, Isaac?" The cat recognised her name and followed Robert Parkin, who was agile for his years, mid-70s. He moved on lean legs, as if he had all the time in the world. He reached the fruit bushes and knelt down again. Isaac Mewton settled beside him dutifully. Despite her male name, she was a neutered female, 4 years old, whom Robert had rescued as a kitten, changing her name from Peanut, which he thought lacked dignity. Robert reached out long fingers and touched the fruit, abundantly crammed on the bushes. Strawberries, currants, raspberries, and gooseberries ready to harvest. We should get a huge crop again, Isaac. We'll make a few batches of jam and freeze a lot of the fruit. That reminds me, the shoots on the pear trees are getting a bit woody. We'll give them a bit of a prune. I'll put that in my diary, in the to-do section." Robert glanced at Isaac, who raised a paw. "All right. Yes, there's no time like the present. Let's pop into the kitchen now and I'll write it down. I suppose it's time for your biscuit ration." He held out a palm and Isaac bumped her head against his fingers. He ruffled her fur affectionately. "And an afternoon cup of tea, I think."